We are continuing our journey through the book of Hebrews, which is a great, great book to be in these days and in these times. And as I shared last week, our lectionary is bringing us through Hebrews. I'm not keeping up with the lectionary because Hebrews is so rich and so full of content that I'm just going to take it as it comes each week, and I'm just going to finish when it's time for me to be done. And what I don't get this week, I'll get next week. And I'm even thinking of taking Hebrews all the way through Advent because it's an Advent book as well. It is a great, great, beautiful, beautiful book that God has given to us. Hebrews has one of the things great about Hebrews is the Bible is a book. Hebrews itself, one of the reasons it's hard to teach through in a given week or day is Hebrews recognize that the Bible is a book. It's a story from beginning to end that has God's people in it, and it's running us through history all the time. And it's running us through events and people of history, and we're always trying to keep up. And it was written to people who were Jews at the time, and they were brothers and sisters in Christ who were struggling to move on from the Old Testament, sacrifices, high priests, myriads of things. And the author of Hebrews is taking that story and saying the story hasn't changed. The story's the same. We're in a different time. We're in a different place, but I know you know the Old Testament stories. I know you know the motif and the narrative of the Old Testament, and so I'm going to walk you through that. And so it was true for them, and it's true for us. And so even each week as I go through Hebrews, I'm going to remind us of that. So the kind of narrative or the motif for Hebrews is one that recognizes that the people of God, are always and always have been a wilderness people. We are a wilderness people. We are, as I said last week, if you are in more modern day terms, if you've read Bunyan's book, Pilgrim's Progress, we are pilgrims on this journey. And this journey that we are on in the book of Hebrews recognizes and then takes us back to the Old Testament. We're not there today, but we're on this journey. We're living our lives here, but we're not living for here. We're actually looking for this heavenly city. We're kind of on this journey to this other city, and in the midst of that journey to the heavenly city, we're looking for our inheritance. That's a word that's going to be used in Hebrews. We're looking for our final goal, our final reality on this journey that we are on. Well, as the Old Testament people of God were a wilderness people, and then ultimately they went into exile. One of the things, if you read the Old Testament, that was true to the people this book was written through, which is true to us, is on our journey, it recognizes that the journey is hard. And the journey is difficult. The journey is filled with anxiety. It's filled with distress. It's filled with exhaustion. And so, taking us back to the beginning of the Bible, God creates everything and then He rests. The people of God in the Old Testament were looking for rest. We are looking for peace. We are looking for rest. And on this journey, it seems like there's nothing but rest, nothing but unrest. We're tired, we're exhausted, we're looking for our heavenly home, we're looking for rest, and just like all times, sometimes God just doesn't seem to be on the journey with us. And that becomes difficult. Like, where is God in the journey? He seems to be silent. He doesn't seem to be speaking. And so then Hebrews talks about, what happens. There's a temptation when that happens. So Hebrews is this really, really beautiful book, but it can seem kind of schizophrenic to us because this really beautiful book where Jesus is bigger and better than everything is filled with these absolutely stern warnings. Like really stern warnings. that seem to think, well, Jesus is beautiful, and if you were raised in the tradition was raised in, and maybe even in the tradition of our own tradition, we talk about the beauty of Jesus, and then we read these passages, and we take what we just gave in one hand, we take it all away. The book of Hebrews doesn't do that. In fact, it points us to that, and it's been beautiful being in it because you begin to see what the stern warnings were about. So much so that it says, if you don't heed these warnings, you know what, you're never going to enter the rest. So, anyway, all that to set us up. So, Hebrews is a book of faith. We walk by faith, not by sight. Great. Hebrews 11, a great faith chapter. Jesus is always bigger. He is always better. And last week, we're following up the text from last week. Because, by the way, this text I'm going to speak on this week was all included in the lectionary with last week's text, and I just was never going to do it all at once anyway. So I'm going to read this. So it's continuing that Jesus is a better priest, but then he's going to blow us away with how much better of a priest he is. So again, these are people that would know the Old Testament. If you had your Old Testament, there was a priestly sacrificial system, and there was a high priest selected from the people of God. And so we start there. Every high priest is selected from the people of God. This would have been the people of God, the Israelites in the Old Testament. And he is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently, so the high priest was not the king, he was the priest. He was kind of the one who would deal more gently, as it were, with the people. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since in the Old Testament, this would be true, he himself was subject to weakness. He was a human too. So when the high priest would go in to offer sacrifices for the people of God, he was also offering sacrifice for himself, because he too was a human. He too was someone who was subject to weakness. This is why he had to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as the sins for the people. So it's just kind of telling a story, a history lesson here. And no one took the honor of being priest on himself, but he receives it when he was called by God, just as Aaron. And Aaron's a guy in the Old Testament who was the first kind of guy that was designated to be a priest. But in the same way, Christ, who is our high priest, we just read that last week, Hebrews 4, he's our high priest, he's passed into the heavens, so he's continuing that thing. Christ didn't take on the glory of becoming a priest, a high priest, but God said to him, the voice of heaven said to him, back in his baptism, "You are my son, today I become your father." And it says in another place, I love the inspired word of God, I don't know where it says it, but somewhere it says that he became a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Well, we know, because we're smarter than the writer of Hebrews, that that's from Psalm 110. But I don't know that I'm smarter than the writer from Hebrews. I just love how whoever's writing that just says, I don't know where it is, but somewhere it says this. Something I would do. I don't know. I didn't learn the chapter and verse of that. So during the days of Jesus' life on earth, and there's a lot to chew on here, and I'm going to still try to cover this all today, he offered up prayers and petition, cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. This is talking about Gethsemane. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. You begin to see at the end how you have the beauty of Jesus, and if you're not careful, you're going to take the beauty of Jesus away, all the beauty of Jesus away from what you just gave. You're going to take it away, and I'm going to hopefully deal with that as we work through here. The priest is a sinner. He's a human. Your pastor is a sinner. The priests were sinners. And the priests, all they did was there was this recognition, I think we engage even the law, so the Old Testament people also were given the law of God, and they were guilty in the law of God. And, if you just lived in those days and you went to tabernacle and you went to temple And say you were even a Gentile, so in the temple there was these Gentile courts. So even if you were a Gentile and going into the courts of God in that day, and you were or a Jew going into the temple, if you went to church, as it were, back in that day, one, it would be just filled with animals, it would be bloody, it would be all of those things. But you would have no mistake of why you went to temple. If a Gentile was trying to learn and understand what this was all about, even in the courts, and they were from another nation and they were coming from the outside to the temple of God, or you went to temple and tabernacle every day and you walked into temple and tabernacle every day, there would be no mistake what the purpose of why you were there was. And it would be one thing: the forgiveness of sin. You could not walk into temple. You could not walk into tabernacle. And that's just what would be screaming at you with all of the blood. Well, why am I here? The forgiveness of sins. The forgiveness of sins. You can't read the Old Testament and not understand that was the purpose of tabernacle at temple. And you were given the forgiveness of sin because the other purpose was in the presence of God. God was present. And God, where God was present, there was forgiveness of sins. It's like Old Testament and should be Christianity 101. Why are we here this morning? For the forgiveness of sins. To hear about it in the presence of God. It's true in the Old Testament. It's true now. So the priests would go. They had the law. And of course, the law was given. And everybody was breaking law. And they were doing it. And it says the priest deals gently. The priest actually, the good high priest understood the law. We sometimes get it confused, and even the priest of our day, whether it's me or others who actually go by the name priest, but the priest can deal gently because he understands that the main purpose of the law was not given so that you and I could just go around and always hold other people accountable to the law. The law was given to hold us accountable. We got to get that backwards. The priest knew that. He knew he was guilty and accountable under the law. He understood that purpose, that the law held him accountable. He wasn't in a position where he could say, here's the law of God, and it holds you accountable. It holds us accountable, and he led that way. Because when he went, he not only offered sacrifices for the people, he was offering sacrifice for himself. But Jesus, and you can go back to, I think, the second slide, Jesus was a high priest too. And so in the wilderness and in the temple and whatever, they continue to offer these high priests. And Jesus, go to the next slide of our text here. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered prayers and petitions. What the writer of Hebrews is doing is saying, he already said last week that Jesus was tempted in every way like we were, but there was one difference. He was without sin. He didn't have to offer a sacrifice for himself because he was sinless. He didn't have to do that. But it says during Jesus' life here on earth, but it still says he's been on the journey before us. And that was kind of the theme last week. He's been on our journey. He's already passed through. He's done this journey. He's done the same journey that you and I are on. He's done the same journey as the people of God, but he's passed through the heavens, and he's now anchored in the heavens, and there's hope for that. And by the way, that's where the rest is in the book, and that's also where the warnings go to that motif or to that reality that Jesus has passed through, and he's been tempted like we are, yet he didn't sin. And now we get kind of him actually being tempted and being engaged like we are, because during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who saved him from death, to the one who could save him from death. And we know he did that in Gethsemane. We also know he did that on the cross. And here we have Jesus in his humanity. He had moments where he wondered where God was too. My God, why have you forsaken me? He has been through that same question. And he's agonized about it. He sweat drops of blood he was so agonized about. He pled. Hebrews is picking up on that theme, but it says that in the midst of it all, something happened with Jesus that was different than us, because it says, to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. And by the way, we will be heard as well, because this has to do, and I'm not going into today with resurrection. Resurrection is everywhere here, but that's for another time in Hebrews. Though he learned obedience from what he'd suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to make a lot of assumptions here. But Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. And what the author is telling us here, that it was in those difficult times, it was in those times where Jesus was in anguish, where Jesus' soul was distressed. It's in those moments that he was learning to trust the Father. He was learning to listen to the Father. And one of the reasons I think we have a hard time understanding this text and many texts is actually, do you know what the Greek word for obey actually literally means? To listen under. Jesus was learning to listen more and more to the voice of the Father that called him his beloved Son. Jesus is learning and growing and listening and placing his trust in a very human way, more and more and more under the Father. And you know where he was learning to do it? He was learning to do it through what he had suffered. I actually think you could make the case, and I may get to this portion of Hebrews later, but given this narrative, given this thing, that Jesus is learning obedience, he's learning to trust through his hardship. Later on in Hebrews, it says that the Father always disciplines the Son in whom he delights in. And I think it betrays our even view of discipline, because I actually think what the writer of Hebrews is doing here is saying Jesus was being disciplined by the Father without sin. He's being disciplined by the Father to learn and to grow and to trust and to listen more and more to the Father. And because Jesus perfectly listened and Jesus perfectly trusted and did not sin, he became yours and my source of our eternal salvation. He is the source. He is the fountain. He is the living water of our salvation. As one who became a man, who grew and grew and grew. Here's where the warnings come in, because what's our temptation to do when things get hard, especially in Western culture? Something bad happens, something terrible happens, like yesterday, and sometimes you even see the mocking that comes, or for even people who are involved, for those going through health issues. What is the question? Where is God? In the Old Testament, Israel went to the wilderness, and they got really upset at God, and they would say things to Moses like, "Why did you bring us out here to die?" God was more evident in Egypt than he was here. You see, in the distress and in the anxiety, in the exhaustion of all of those things on that 3x5 card I talked about last week that we bring us anxiety, that we want changed, whether it's our family, whether it's our children, whatever it is, in the midst of all of that, in the book of Hebrews tells us our hearts can become hardened toward God. and we quit listening. We quit trusting. There was apostasy going on in Hebrews. And once you read the book of Hebrews, you know what the apostasy, and I said this last week, the apostasy in Hebrews, the hardening of the heart was moving away from Jesus plus nothing is everything. It's why there was no rest for the people of God in the wilderness, right? Because they didn't trust God to bring them into the land. They didn't believe God was sufficient. They didn't believe God alone was sufficient. They had looked at their own eyes and they thought maybe God could help, but they thought, well, we can't go into that land. We can't do that, and so we're not going to do that. And Jesus says, if you don't believe Jesus plus nothing equals everything, be warned, you will never enter rest. What happened in the Old Testament? They never entered rest because of their disobedience. And what does obedience mean? It's because they did not listen to the promises of God. And so even here, back in Hebrews 4:3, it says that those who believe in rest and obedience are all tied together. And then we get to this passage. Is the writer of Hebrews schizophrenic? He became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. Did he just take away what he just gave? I mean, I don't know. I believe even in our tradition, at times this can be, he became the source of eternal salvation, but by the time you get done reading that verse, who do we make into the source of our eternal salvation? Ourselves, right? Isn't that what he says? For the source of eternal salvation for all who by, and by the way, he's the source of all of your eternal salvation, but not if you don't work hard enough. What does the word obey mean? He became the source of eternal salvation for all those who believe that Jesus plus nothing is everything, for all those who listen to him, for all those that recognize that he is their only hope forever. The writer of Hebrews is not giving to you and I Jesus is the source of eternal salvation and then taking it away as if we were on probation and we will never know. In fact, the whole tenor of Hebrews and what we're about to read even in this passage, even in the next phrase, is saying something beautiful and great about how he truly is the source of our eternal salvation, how he truly is our high priest, how he truly does sit on the throne of grace, so that though we are naked and exposed, as we talked about last week in Hebrews 4:12 and 13, though we are naked and exposed and nothing is hidden from his sight, he's still our high priest, and there's still grace and there's still mercy, but there is no grace and there is no mercy for those who take their nakedness and exposing and try to cover themselves with their own fig leaves. There's no rest for that. You'll never enter God's rest if that's the truth. But there is rest for you and I in a throne room called grace, where 2 verses earlier we were exposed and naked and nothing hidden from God's sight. Remember, the question of last week is, what does God do with what he sees? What does God do with, because he does see. He does see. So the question is, what does he do with what he sees? And this is where the book of Hebrews is so beautiful. He becomes our high priest. He lives the life and he passes through to the heavens. He sits on a throne called grace. And he becomes a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. I'm going to end there because who in the heck is Melchizedek? You know, as we work through that reality, Melchizedek is an obscure person. He has about 3 or 4 verses 3 or 4 verses in the Old Testament where he appears, and then he quickly disappears. I'm not going to do it. It is in the book of Genesis. I'm not going to say everything. But there is one problem with Jesus being our high priest, especially for these readers. These readers are Jewish people. Aaron was the first high priest. What's the problem with Jesus being a high priest? He's not from the line. He's not a Levite. Only Levites, the law specifically said. In fact, if someone other than a Levite tried to be a priest, then that's blasphemy. He's not a Levite. And yet he's claiming this priesthood onto himself. How can that be if you're a Jewish person? You know, what did I read my Old Testament for? He's not a Levite. He can't be the high priest. But there was a priest that appeared in the pages of Scripture before Jacob ever had any sons. And he appeared to Abraham. And Melchizedek is this guy who actually some people think was a picture of the incarnate Christ, because Melchizedek actually was superior to Abraham. He appeared to Abraham. He kind of appeared out of nowhere, and he demanded Abraham give him tithes of 20%. He then blessed Abraham. You have no record of any lineage of Melchizedek. He comes. There's no record of his death. He doesn't come. And so he actually points these people back to someone they know and says that Jesus is the source of our eternal salvation, because he is after the order of Melchizedek, who we don't even know if he was born, and we don't know if he even died, but he is the eternal source of salvation because he's after that order, and he's greater than Melchizedek. He's greater than that priest that we know really nothing about. He's greater than Abraham. He's greater than Isaac. Levi got superseded by Melchizedek, and Melchizedek got succeeded by Christ. And you can go to the next slide that's not in my scripture here, because Hebrews 7 talks about Melchizedek and Jesus being after Melchizedek. And because he is after the order of Melchizedek, and this is almost the theme, climactic verse of all of the book of Hebrews right here, but because Jesus is the high priest who is after the order of Melchizedek, there's a consequence for that. There's a therefore for that, because he is the one who lived the life, who already passed into heavens, who had anguish, had exhaustion, and had tears, but he perfectly trusted. He perfectly believed that Jesus plus nothing is everything. He perfectly did that. There's a consequence to him being after the order of Melchizedek, and here's the consequence. He is not of the tribe of Levi. Every priest died. There was always a succession of priests, but there's not going to be a Jesus, and here's the consequence of that. Because he is after the order of Melchizedek, because he is the priest that is forever, he can actually save you and I completely, to the end, to the max, every dark corner, every horrific habit, every horrible deed. He can save us to the uttermost, those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for us. He's the eternal flame. He is the eternal priest. And because he's after the order of Melchizedek, he's never off the job. And I will tell you this right now, if he ever for a second quit making intercession for you and I, we would all be damned. It's a beautiful thing. Jesus is the great high priest. And you want to know what he's doing right now? He's praying for you. And he's praying for me. Just as he prayed for Peter. Peter, I know Satan's going to sift you like wheat. It's interesting what he prayed for Peter, because he's praying for Peter the last night, and Peter is going to be sifted like wheat. Peter is going to sin, and Peter is going to deny. But you know what Jesus prays? He prays that Peter's faith would hold in the midst of his sin. And of course it did. He prayed that even though Satan was going to come sift Peter like wheat, that Peter would hold on to Jesus plus nothing is everything. He prayed that Peter would obey. Not, certainly he didn't want Peter to deny him, but the ultimate act of obedience is that we walk by faith. We don't walk by sight. There is no rest, the writer of Hebrews is saying, to those who walk by sight. If you walk by sight, your heart will become hard. It is Reformation Sunday. 95% of you didn't even know that. All Saints' Day is November 1st. I learned this week that's Joan's birthday. When the church, Protestants, if you even celebrate what Martin Luther did in arresting a church that had become hardened to Jesus plus nothing is everything. It used to be when I was in my younger years at Nature Coast, before the Lord helped me learn some obedience through church splits, that on Reformation Sunday I would always give the State of the Church address. It just makes me gag saying that. How anti-Reformation? Because you know where the state of the church is? It is seated and anchored at the right hand of the Father forever. That is the state of the church of Jesus Christ. And any church that doesn't attach themselves to that reality, the state of that church is not very good at all, no matter what's going on in the church. The eternal flame. You know what an eternal flame is? When I was in high school, I went to Arlington Seminary, and there was an eternal flame at John F. Kennedy's grave that just burns endlessly. An eternal flame is a symbol of something that will never, ever end. And you can go to the last slide, which is from the book of Leviticus, which is a book we never read. But we're talking about the sin offerings. Here we are in the temple, and we are in the tabernacle. And here is the flame that even in the Old Testament shall be kept burning on the altar continually, and it shall never go out. So that if you were a people of God or a pilgrim or a sojourner, there's an eternal flame of sacrifice in the presence of God. That would never go out. You know, the warnings of the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrews, there's this reformational word that actually is an Old Testament saying from the book of Habakkuk that actually is repeated 3 times. It's rare something gets repeated 3 times in the New Testament. It actually will be repeated in Hebrews 10. The just, the righteous shall live by faith. That was Luther's battle cry, because it's Scripture's battle cry. It's Hebrews' battle cry. And even the Hebrews passage, when it says the just shall live by faith, it's actually in a warning passage. It says, don't shrink back from that. I am warning you in the sternest of ways. Do not shrink back from Jesus plus nothing is everything, or you will never enter my rest. Because the just shall live by Jesus plus nothing is everything. The just, the righteous shall live by faith and not sight. And that faith, The battle cry of the Reformation was a gift from God, not of works, lest we should boast. Obedient ones really means that we're just all ears. We are all ears. That's what the writer of Hebrews is saying. Even in the book of Revelation, Jesus says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. That's language of Hebrews for obedience. We are all ears. And you know what those ears hear? The Word of God. Those words hear the book of Hebrews. Those words hear that he is for you and he is for me as our high priest. Those words are for you and me, that he is Emmanuel, that he is with us. Our ears hear he is for us and he is with us. And he is mighty to save. That is what he who has ears to hear, let him hear that he's for you. Let him hear that he is with you. Let him hear that he saves you to the uttermost. That is the battle cry of the Reformation. And by faith in that word, faith in the word that comes from the Father, through the Son, and in the Holy Spirit, through that faith, we live. Because the righteous will live by faith. Our faith is in the eternal, always making intercession, God, for us. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. If he is ever living and making, Jesus did not become our high priest so that we could sin. Jesus actually became our high priest because we do sin. I don't know why that's so hard. Why we have to couch it so much. Jesus did not become our high priest so that we get to sin. But Jesus did become our high priest because we do sin, which is assumed because he ever lives and makes intercession for us. And John says that if you have no sin, you're a liar. So what does our obedience must mean? Are we listening to the Father? Are we constantly turning back? As we're prone to wander, Lord, we feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart. Oh, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. We struggle. But even in that struggle, you know the same verse that encourages us not to quench the Holy Spirit. We always stop there so we can crucify people. But you know what the rest of that verse says? Don't quench this burning and accessoring flame. Don't quench your faith. You know why we don't quench the Spirit? Because it's in the Spirit that you and I are sealed and delivered for the day of redemption. That's not a verse about probation. It's a verse reminding us of our status, of our reality, that we are sealed by this Spirit to the day of redemption. And yet we're prone, every one of us this week will quench that Spirit and turn our voice and listening ears to gossip, to sex, to the bottle, to rage, to family, to children, where there is no rest. The writer of Hebrews is saying there's one place of rest, and it's in a throne called grace, by a high priest who's not after Levi, but he's after Melchizedek. And he burns grace for us forever. Amen.